Okay, so what we're looking at this session is macro performance and conflict, and in particular we are trying to look at the year 2014. And as everybody knows now, the UK economy and the European economies and the American economies and even the Chinese economies have all been through a pretty difficult time, and so therefore we've had to have some pretty extraordinary economic policies to get over the current issues that we had, say, in 2008. And the most striking policy that we've had during this time is monetary policy, where we've had incredibly low interest rates for 5 years, 0.5%, and we've had a low exchange rate, and the government has gone out and printed £360 billion worth, and they pushed that into the economy as well. And right now, actually, since 2011, the government is embarked on a policy of fiscal contraction expansion. And what this means is that they're decreasing G, and at the same time they're hoping that the private sector takes up the slack. So what we're looking at is there always a conflict in every single policy that you do? We're going to start with the monetarists. The monetarists, who also believe in the money supply, but we do that at a later stage on the course. They strongly believe that the best way of solving any economic problem was just to use supply side economics. And they've had some pretty extreme versions of this. So, for example, Milton Friedman advised the Chilean government on how they should introduce supply side, and in a sense he gave the whole country a massive dose of shock treatment, and immediately tried to get it over to supply side economics, and it didn't really work, because what happened was every single industry was privatized, some entrepreneurs came in, they brought up all the industries, loads of people lost their jobs, and people were left starving on the streets. So having a really strong supply side doesn't always work. It's got to be done slowly and with the right level of, I suppose, communicating what your ideas are to people, but also to keep a check on the private sector. And obviously recently that's happened with the banking sector. Everybody always saw in the UK that the banking sector was fantastic until the banking crisis came along, and it clearly got out of hand during that period of time. Okay, so, but we're going to look at macroeconomic policy and conflict. And this up here is a monetarist diagram all the way up here. And fundamentally, what they say is it is all about supply side economics. And if you increase AD, what happens is, if you increase AD, so you move from A to B, in the short run you will get a rise in real GDP, and you will also get a fall in unemployment. So that's obviously, there is a trade-off there. However, what happens is, when you get the fall in unemployment, those workers will then ask for higher wages, and what happens then is the short run aggregate supply curve will shift from SRAS to SRAS dash, and the workers will ask for higher wages. When that happens, firms will employ fewer people. So therefore they're not for demand side policies. They believe that everything is about supply side economics, and in a sense they teach us an important lesson that with supply side there is no conflict. But as I just said in the example about Chile, it depends how you introduce it into an economy, which is obviously very important. So just to go over this one again, we start off at place A. The government decides that it wants to reduce unemployment, so therefore it increases AD. What we find is we move to here, that leads to a rise in GDP, therefore a fall in unemployment, but also a rise in the price level. So therefore there is a trade-off between the two situations. What happens then is there's a shortage of workers in the labour market, therefore they demand higher wages, so therefore the SRAS curve will shift up from there to there. So we move from A to B to C, because with higher wages firms will employ fewer people. But monetarism is all about supply side economics. Okay. So for example, the best example is talking about corporation tax. I always talk about corporation tax. Corporation tax is now 21%. Remember, the government said every single year it's going to decrease it by 1%. The IOD wants it to be 15%. Alistair Heath wants it to be 0%. The Centre for Economics and Business Research, they want it to be the same as Ireland, which is 12.5%. They believe if you cut corporation tax, say 12.5% is here. If you cut corporation tax, and right now we're here at 21%, if you cut corporation tax, you're going to get more revenue back because those firms will then employ more people, they'll pay more income tax, and we get more tax returns. So that appears to be a win-win situation. However, so that's corporation tax. But there are problems. Another one is, okay, we always want to get growth, but there's always problems with growth. If you get too much growth, you're going to end up with demand pull inflation. If you get too much growth, particularly in the UK, as we just discussed in lesson 67, the previous lesson, we're going to go out and we're going to buy more imports, so that leads to more trade debt. And there's also the fact that if we get more growth, the environment is going to be hit. But I think we have to remember here, in terms of the environment, that the UK is only responsible for 2% of all global emissions. And really, the world's biggest polluter right now is China, closely followed by America. The Chinese, though, always argue that America's been polluting for hundreds and hundreds of years, where they've only been polluting now for 30 years. So really, they have the biggest obligation in terms of trying to sort out the environmental debt problem. But that is still a problem of growth. With monetary policy, there are lots of trade-offs. If you have lower interest rates, that could then lead to demand pull inflation. I think you all know the diagram by now. So here we are, we shift up here, we just increase AD, we're going to end up with a positive output gap, and we will end up with demand pull inflation. A low exchange rate, particularly that's the policy that we followed in the UK right now, a low exchange rate, that will lead to a rise in import prices. If import prices go up, that will then lead to cost push inflation. Therefore, then workers may ask for higher wages, and then you have an inflationary spiral going on within the economy. The danger of both of these is, particularly low interest rates, is that it will lead to a house price boom again. And that's exactly what we had in the nice decade between 1997 and 2007. However, if you do own a house prices shoot up, therefore we become wealthier, therefore we feel better off, therefore that will lead to a rise in consumption and everything else. But right now, this is sort of okay because we sort of want more aggregate demand in the UK economy. So with monetary policy, there is a lot of conflict there. If we print money, which is also part of monetary policy, and that's what we've been doing, you increase the money supply. If you're a monetarist, you believe that will lead to a rise in inflation, and it probably will lead to a rise in AD. But I've got something pretty important on here, which is really what this does is it gives you time to implement your supply side reform. So actually, I'm quite a big fan of printing money. It depends how you print it. On this time around, they gave it to the banks, which for me wasn't the best idea. I would have invested directly into the economy, but I'll leave that for another day. But if we have supply side economics, it gives us time in the UK to introduce those supply side reforms, which will mean that the economy can progress. One of those supply side reforms is clearly decreasing corporation tax. There's also labour market flexibility, 0-hour contracts, deregulation, all of those sorts of things. And if you introduce those sorts of things, then you may eventually survive, as well as improving the whole banking system. Finally, so right now in the year 2014, although I've got 1997 to 2007 drawn up on the board, but if we move on to the year 2014, we have still got a consumer-led recovery. We've still got a lot of consumer debt hanging around. We've still got loads and loads of government debt. This year our budget deficit will be 7.5% of GDP. That is still the largest budget deficit in the whole of Europe. So actually our economy is still being propelled forward, despite what the Labour Party say, by C and G. Why have I just said that? Because we are still using the same techniques that we used during this period of time. However, the government has tried to introduce some supply side reform, and it has cut G from its very, very high level. And this then has led to fiscal expansionary contraction, where we've cut G, which has led to a growth in the private sector. So there is conflict in all these policies, but ultimately I believe our monetary policy, which is incredibly aggressive, is giving us time to implement a supply side policy. I would argue actually that the supply side policies need to be stronger. I'm also a big fan actually of intervention supply side, which is the government cutting down on revenue expenditure and putting lots of money into capital expenditure to improve the whole infrastructure of the economy. And as an environmentalist, that would obviously be green technology. So here we go. So with any macro performance, there is always conflict. Ultimately, you can talk about supply side economics, there is no conflict, but then you can talk about monetary policy right now. There's a lot of conflict in terms of those policies. There's also a lot of conflict with fiscal policy, because clearly, if you do happen to go out, you do increase government spending, then certainly that will lead to a rise in national debt, and national debt creates all sorts of problems. It leads to the crowding out effect, higher interest payments on your debt, and less fiscal sustainability, less confidence. So with most policies there is conflict. However, with supply side economics, we go back to the previous lecture I've given, supply side can solve everything, but we also need some demand on there as well.